In the entire history of the Olympics, more than 10,000 athletes each summer games and 3,000 each winter since 1896, this would have applied to one woman who did not place in anything. Now, this isn't true. Up first, honestly, I've been less interested in covering trans news and trans activism and other stuff lately because I feel like it's just territory we've treaded before and it's not really where the culture and momentum is. And we cover that stuff on the Normal Gaze podcast anyway. But this story actually is really big. And it, to me at least, is an obvious win for sanity that's already being hit with some pretty misleading media spin and some extremely stupid critiques from like far left people online and kind of gender ideologues and trans activists. So this is, of course, the announcement today that the Olympic Committee has put out new rules that will essentially, the TLDR of it all is they will restrict women's competitions at the Olympics, women's sports, to only biological females. Oh my God. Can you believe? What in the Handmaid's Tale is going on here? Now, so this is viewed as a trans issue, right? Because there's this huge controversy over whether transgender women who are born biologically male should be allowed to compete in women's sports. But it actually more significantly affects intersex or people with disorders of sexual development. So you've had a couple athletes over the years, like Caster Semenya, or most recently Iman Khalif, the boxer, who are not transgender. They compete in, they believe that they're female from birth and they have mixed external genitalia, but they have some elements of being biologically male, like testes, and it gets very complicated and scientific, but they are essentially in some ways biologically male, but they might have female genitalia. They might have been appeared as women and been raised as women, but they're not like trans women. But anyway, they will also be excluded. So that's actually probably the more significant impact of this. But it's being, of course, interpreted as a trans issue. Interestingly enough, the most accurate headline from this story comes from the BBC. So here's that headline: Olympic women's sports limited to biological females. And then alternatively, you've got some US media outlets like the Associated Press breaking: trans women athletes are banned from the Olympics by a new IOC policy on female eligibility. Similarly, NBC News says breaking: transgender women are banned from participating in the Olympics beginning with the 2028 Games in Los Angeles. And those headlines are rather misleading because it's not quite correct to say that trans women are banned from the Olympics. I mean, in effect, there probably won't be any competing after this. There probably wasn't going to be any competing anyway, which is why this is really more of a cultural debate and kind of philosophical debate than a practical one, as applied to the trans, at least. Obviously, with the people with DSDs or intersex conditions, it's a little more relevant. But they're not banned. They just have to compete in male categories if they're going to compete because they are male when it comes to biology, not identity. And really, biology is the meaningful characteristic when it comes to the safety and fairness of sports, not how you identify or how you present socially. So I did think it was interesting that like media dichotomy here. But anyway, the woman behind this decision, or kind of the figurehead, has put out a video announcing the statement on behalf of the International Olympic Committee. And I thought it was really interesting and nuanced and thoughtful. Here's that video.
Today, we, the International Olympic Committee, have published a policy on the protection of the female category. I understand that this is a very sensitive topic. As a former athlete, I passionately believe in the rights of all Olympians to take part in fair competition. The policy that we have announced is based on science, and it has been led by medical experts with the best interests of athletes at its heart. The scientific evidence is very clear. Male chromosomes give performance advantages in sports that rely on strength, power, or endurance. At the Olympic Games, even the smallest margins can be the difference between victory and defeat.
I'm sorry, I just want to pause on that and say it's crazy that what she's saying was ever contested, but it was rather viciously. But we actually have to like unironically assert and prove, and obviously there's plenty of evidence behind it, but like we have to prove that males have strength advantages over females. Like something went horribly wrong as a culture that this was ever even a live question or debate.
So it's absolutely clear that it would not be fair for biological males to compete in the female category. In addition, in some sports, it would simply not be safe. Every
True.
athlete must be treated with dignity and respect, and athletes will only need to be screened once in their lifetime. There must be clear education around the process, with counseling available alongside expert medical advice. The IOC recognizes the importance of widespread participation in grassroots and recreational sports programs and the impact that sport has in society. However, the Olympic Games has a focus on elite sport, and in elite sport, we must ensure the fairness, safety, and integrity of all competitions within the Games. I know that there will be many questions, and the IOC will work with all of our stakeholders to address these over the coming months. Publication of the policy is just one step in the process. There will be much more information to come.
So we're going to get to some of the like unhinged discourse and backlash and people crashing out over this. But at first, I do just want to praise this woman, the president of the IOC here, for just taking such a measured and thoughtful approach. They're obviously, in my view, doing the right thing. They're prioritizing safety and fairness for women in women's sports. Crazy concept. But she's not doing this in a hateful way. She's just talking about the science, and she's acknowledging that, like, obviously everybody should be treated with respect, and we do want everybody to be able to participate in sports. I just appreciated in our insanely hot culture war moment that she didn't take any sort of like hot take, trying to go viral approach, and actually put out a thoughtful and nuanced statement. But much of the discourse around this online is already, spoiler alert, not particularly thoughtful or particularly nuanced. Let's talk about some of the backlash, because this just broke this morning, I believe. So there hasn't been too much discussion of it yet beyond social media, but the chatter on social media is predictably ridiculous. One of our favorite, just like if you're looking for somebody to give you a terrible woke take or spread some casual left-wing misinformation, Matt Bernstein, the YouTuber and influencer, of course, he's like non-binary or whatever and has the they pronouns, but we don't do that here. Anyway, he put out a tweet dismissing this that is, of course, factually false, but let's read this. In the entire history of the Olympics, more than 10,000 athletes each summer games and 3,000 each winter since 1896, this would have applied to one woman who did not place in anything. Now, this isn't true, as I'll explain in a moment, but then why do you care? This is one of the things they always say. It's like when we tried to restrict children from getting irreversible medical procedures, they argued that never happens. And then we're like, okay, then why do you mind if we restrict it? Same thing. If your argument is there are no trans women that are ever going to compete in the Olympics, it's never going to be a fairness or safety issue, then you should not care or be outraged by a policy prohibiting them because it won't have any impact then, by your own logic. Now, more importantly, this is not true, because the policy isn't. It is true that there haven't been any trans women, as that term is traditionally understood, who've dominated at the Olympics. So I guess it certainly could happen. We've seen some trans athletes in high-level collegiate sports dominate, and it's a kind of years from now, it's very possible they could end up at the Olympic level. So I think it's reasonable enough to just take it off the table because of that. But more importantly, the kind of very loose guidelines and rules that were put in place, in part due to the demands of the kind of gender activist world, have allowed people who are genetically and biologically male, such as Iman Khalif, to not just compete in women's sports, but women's boxing. I mean, you had somebody who is genetically male and had a male strength advantage beating the crap out of women in Olympic boxing. So you can't, and the whole world saw that and isn't going to just believe you that this isn't affecting anyone. So the post is objectively false, but it's also a very self-defeating argument, because if this is actually inconsequential, as you suggest, then why do you fight so hard to resist it? It's like a total misuse of your energy and time and political capital. And this is an interesting take from the radical trans activist and Harvard clinical instructor Alejandro Caraballo. who is a trans woman, I believe, Alejandra wrote, there are going to be a lot of intersex cis women, especially, wow, the language is so muddled here, especially from the global south, who will be ruled ineligible and then subjected to terrible discrimination or worse in their home countries. Prior sex testing regimes have resulted in, oh, we'll have to bleep that, but self-deletion and ruin lives. This policy is much more problematic for intersex athletes. They were assigned female at birth, socialized as women, and have female genitalia, but will be classified as male. Their entire sports career will be ruined for this cruel eugenicist project of sex purity. There's so much to unpack in this crazy statement. I really don't know where to begin. Eugenicist? What does this have to do with like eugenics and the no one's talking about reproduction and the gene pool? Like, sometimes I struggle to even unpack this kind of thing. I think it is highly unlikely and without evidence to suggest that there are going to be a lot of these female athletes who undergo sex testing and suddenly discover that they're not female. There might be a few, and I actually definitely acknowledge that that would be very tough and strange to find yourself in that situation. And that's why in the IOC's announcement, they talked about having counseling available for the sex testing for anyone who does get an unexpected result. And I sure have a lot of sympathy for anybody with an intersex condition, though they are pretty rare, because that would be a very tough experience, especially if you come from a developing country or maybe a more traditionalist or religious country. I acknowledge that, but like those people should be excluded from female sports because they have a biological advantage if they are in fact genetically male. So it's, for example, in the case of somebody who is assigned female at birth, socialized as a woman, well, those things don't really matter, Alejandra, because you can be assigned this is why all this language is so muddled and confusing and not accurate, all this activist language. That just means the doctor made a mistake when observing your sex, because there's a tiny, tiny, tiny number of people who may have female genitalia, but actually be genetically male and have testes and produce testosterone and respond to testosterone. Um, yeah, that means that they made a mistake, and what actually matters is the underlying thing, not the genitalia. So those people shouldn't be allowed to compete in women's sports. That's how you end up with Iman Khalif beating the crap out of women to the point where they thought they were going to die, and they say they've never been hit so hard in their life. These are professional female boxers. Obviously that's an insane outcome. And so I think we can acknowledge, without overstating it and suggesting like there's just going to be hundreds of female athletes suddenly discovering that they have male chromosomes, we could acknowledge and have some empathy or sympathy for people who are intersex and maybe don't know about it and discover it, without like allowing blatantly unfair and unsafe conditions in high level sports. See how there's just no common sense here? There really is not. And then here's another take from this left-wing writer, Thomas Willett. The new Olympic rule bans only trans women from women's events. Trans men aren't mentioned at all. If this were truly about fairness and safety, it would apply consistently. Targeting one specific group raises serious questions about the real motive. Well, so it's, again, we already talked about this, that it's not really accurate to say this only affects trans women. It also affects people who compete in the women's category traditionally but have DSDs or intersex conditions like a Caster Semenya or like a Iman Khalif. But more importantly, this is such a dumb argument, because the reason the rules don't apply to trans men, which are people who present themselves as men but are biologically female, is because they don't have an advantage. If anything, they have a disadvantage. A trans man who's a biological female trying to compete in male sports is not making the other male athletes unsafe in any way, is only at a disadvantage compared to those athletes. So that's why. In fact, I actually think the opposite of what Thomas is saying here is true, is that if the Olympics did restrict trans men when there is no disadvantage, if they just banned all people who identify as trans from participating at all, for example, that would be more indicative of actual animus or discrimination. But when you have policies, and I've always advocated for this, even at like the high school level, I believe that if you have a trans identifying student who wants to play on the boys team but is biologically female, they should be allowed to try out and make it if they're good enough. But just not the other way around. I actually think that it's a sign that this policy is not rooted in hatred or bigotry or animus, that it only does apply to the women's division. So he has it totally backwards, if you ask me. And listen, I just think that this is an obvious win for sanity. The people who are still dying on this hill, I just don't understand it. And the fact that this is still policy in many blue states, that biologically male people can compete in women and girls sports subject to their self-identification, is lunacy. The fact that so many major LGBT activist organizations still stand on business and die on this hill, that they should be allowed to. I mean, it's all so ridiculous and it's so deeply counterproductive. Like, I really do resent the fact that my identity or my rights as a gay man was ever lumped in with like just absurd anti-science nonsense. I do absolutely acknowledge that, once again, there were not many, or really any, that I'm aware of, trans women athletes about to compete in the 2028 Olympics. But it doesn't mean that the policy is therefore illegitimate, because like we talked about, it does apply to real issues involving intersex or DSD athletes, and you take it off the table. And frankly, it's just a common sense win that never should have been opposed by anybody with two brain cells to rub together.